Okay, today we're working on a 2010 Ram half-ton four-wheel drive rear axle pinion nut. Now this truck has had the factory recall done on it to have the pinion nut secured or fastened to where it's not supposed to come loose. So the factory recall, their answer was to put this piece of junk in there, and it also failed because my pinion nut came loose. I started getting a lot of vibration from the rear end, and as you can see, I got some oil splattered around under here where my yoke started to come loose and leak. Some of it started to hit on the muffler and the tailpipe, causing it to smoke, and didn't take me long to figure out where that smell was coming from. Differential fluid has a very distinct smell, especially when it's burning. So I inspected the yoke and found it leaking. I didn't know at first what the problem was. First I thought it was just the seal on the yoke, but when I pulled the drive shaft off, I saw oil coming out of here, and that means the nut has come loose. Upon taking this piece of junk out, which does not come out the way they say it does with a pair of snap ring pliers — you'll break your snap ring pliers if you're not careful — it is very difficult to get this piece of junk out of there. It sits over the nut like this and inside the bore here. You cannot get anything behind it to pry it out, so you have to use some kind of snap ring device. But the trick to this thing is you don't just pull it. You got to work it back and forth very carefully, very gently, or you'll break your snap ring pliers. It is very difficult to take out. You have to loosen these two set screws. I've got them in the piece so they don't get lost. You have to loosen these two set screws first. You see it split on the back, so when you tighten them it spreads this thing out to where it grips inside that bore, and it's not supposed to turn, but it did anyway. My pinion nut came loose. Luckily I caught it before there was any damage done to the gearbox. I just had a lot of vibration and noise, and the oil started to leak around the yoke and out the front of the nut because it wasn't tight. Now, the factory setting says that this pinion nut is supposed to be at 210 foot-pounds of torque. If some of you guys are like me, I didn't realize that my torque wrench only goes to 150 foot-pounds, so I had to buy another torque wrench specifically for this job. 210 foot-pounds is the torque setting for 2010 Dodge Ram 1500. I called the factory to verify that because it's not anywhere on the net that I could find. There's nothing about a 2010 on Google, but you can find 94 through 08. So, back to the pinion nut. I'm going to remove this thing completely, clean it the best I can, and I'm going to put some Loctite on it. The dealer recommended putting some blue Loctite on there, the removable type, so if you ever do have to go back in here, you can still get the nut off, but it'll help keep it from coming loose. So we'll put the Loctite in there. We'll put the little junk. I wish I knew the engineer that came up with this so I could give him a piece of my mind. But we'll put this piece of junk back in there as well with the Loctite and with the nut properly torqued to 210 foot-pounds. We'll see what happens then. Okay, to remove this pinion nut, it's a 210 foot-pounds is what the torque is supposed to be on it. So I'm going to use my impact to get it off of there. This is a 1 5/16 socket, and I'm just going to take this thing off real quick. And it's pretty tight, so I'm going to go up a notch on my impact here. We're on 3. I'm going to go to 4 with it. See if we can knock this thing loose. There we go. So now it's off of there. Now, we're going to clean these threads really good. We're going to clean the inside of this nut out really good, get all the oil out of it, and we're going to put some Loctite in there and put it back together and put it to the proper torque setting. Okay, I put a little bit of blue Loctite on my threads. You can see it there. oozing out the end of the nut. And I'm going to tighten this thing to the proper torque now that I've got the Loctite in there. I'm going to go ahead and use the impact to start with. I just put it on 1, which is the lowest setting, and I'll get it snug with that. If I can get the thing to work. Okay, we had a little malfunction with the impact gun, but I think we're back in business now. We'll just snug this thing up. Again, I'm on the lowest setting on the impact gun. I don't want to tighten it past the factory recommended torque because I want to use my torque wrench to make sure that I am at the specified torque, which is 210 foot-pounds. Okay, we've got this thing torqued to 210 foot-pounds, and I forgot to mention earlier that you're going to have to lock your emergency brake, or if you still have your tires on the vehicle. Mine's up on jack stands right now without the tires on it. So I had to lock my emergency brake to keep the yoke from turning so I could torque this thing to 210 foot-pounds. Now, we're going to put the factory keeper back in here from the factory recall that they did on this truck. This is supposed to help keep the pinion nut from coming loose. So this thing just slides in there around the pinion nut, and I'm going to put the 2 holes down right here and put those down here where I can reach them easily with the snap ring plier to put them back in. So I'm just going to set that up there for now and grab my snap ring plier, and you have to collapse this thing a little bit with the snap ring plier to get it to slide in, which it's kind of painful, and I'm going to try to do this and hold the camera at the same time where you can see it. But you get your snap ring plier in the holes there. Yeah, it's trying to fall out. Anyway, you're going to put your snap ring pliers in these holes. You can see the 2 holes right there where my thumb is. Right here. I can't hold the camera and do this at the same time, so I just have to put it in there. It goes in there like that. You squeeze these 2 together and slide it in. And make sure it's flush below this bore so it doesn't hit on the back side of your drive shaft when you put your drive shaft back on. Alright, so I'm going to put that thing in and I'm going to tighten the set screws. Okay, now we have our retainer back in place, and you'll need to tighten these set screws back down so the flanges will spread and grip the way they're supposed to. So we'll just put the set screw down till it's snug. I'll do the same thing to the other side. It may not be necessary to alternate, but I'm going to. I'm going to snug one side and snug the other, then I'll go back and tighten one side and tighten the other. So I do not have a torque setting for these very small Allen screws right here, these set screws. So I'm just going to snug them up and go a little, just using one finger. Just get it as tight as I can. And I'm going to call that good. So all it does is spread that thing out and make it grip inside the bore, and it holds the nut in place to keep it from backing off. I'm going to go back and forth a couple times to make sure I've got this thing good and snug on both sides. We do not want this to come loose because this is what's supposed to hold our pinion nut and keep it from coming loose. If the pinion nut does come loose, in case some of you guys don't know, your yoke is going to come out of the rear end, the drive shaft's going to hit the ground, and it's going to rip it right out of the truck. So you'll be stuck on the side of the road with nothing but neutral because you don't have a drive shaft to drive your truck. Okay, I'm not a differential specialist, but I read this, so I thought I'd pass it on to you guys. Once you have this to the proper torque, you should be able to put an inch-pound torque wrench on here. And the specification says that the rotational force of this yoke should be between 10 and 20 foot-pounds. Or 10 and 20 inch-pounds, I'm sorry. And if it's more than that or less than that, you have something wrong. Your gear lash is not set right, your backlasher run out is wrong. It'll have to be adjusted. I'm not a rear end specialist, so that would be something I would have done at the factory because I don't have the tools or equipment to set or adjust the backlash of the rear end or any of that. So the only thing we have left here to do is check the rotational force, and then we will bolt the drive shaft back up. That's the easy part. So, if anybody doesn't know, there's 4 bolts in the yoke on the drive shaft, and put them back where they came out. I marked mine before I took it out. I've got a mark on my yoke, and I've got a mark on my drive shaft flange, so I know exactly where to line it back up. It does look like the yoke is balanced because it has holes drilled in it, and I believe this is balanced to the drive shaft to keep from getting vibration. But anyway, we're going to put the drive shaft back on and take this thing for a spin and see how it does.